Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the summer lecture series here at College of the Atlantic. My name is Catherine Klinger. I'm a professor of art history and the Alan Stone Chair of the Visual Arts here at the college. Darren was unable to come today, so I have the distinct and wonderful pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Ms. Nicholas is the recipient of the National Book Critics Circle Award for her book, The Rape of Europa, as well as the author of Cruel World, The Children of Europe in the Nazi Web, which was published in 2005. Her excellent scholarship, and I feel like I can say this with authority, her excellent scholarship concerning Europe's displaced and/or looted art has been recognized by the government of France as she was elected to the Légion d'honneur, and she was also honored by the people of Poland as an amicus Poloniae. A recent film was a fictionalized account of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section established in 1943 under the Civil Affairs and Military Government section of the Allied Army. Sorry, that's a long term that I need to read. They were tasked with preserving and protecting the artistic and cultural treasures of Europe during this time of conflict during World War II. However, the true story of these heroes and the context, which is quite important to us historians, in which they performed their work, was first told in her fine book, Rape of Europa. Her book is based on meticulous research in primary sources, correspondence, government documents, personal accounts, interviews that she did with many of the protagonists that were still living. The work is rather an intellectual's adventure story that includes the exploits of individuals such as the mild-mannered French art historian Rose Valland, who secured on her own close to 60,000 works of art to protect them. Her book is here. She has graciously agreed to take questions following her talk and also to sign copies of it. And you probably have noticed small sheets of paper on which you can place your name and join a raffle. We ran out because we have such a great audience today. So be patient. We'll have more opportunities for you to have a wee piece of paper to put your name on. So with no further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lynn Nicholas.
Thank you very much, and I'm especially happy to be at the College of the Atlantic. I'm sort of everything but a graduate. My son graduated from here, my daughter-in-law, and my stepfather was a trustee, so I have long connections to this wonderful place, and we've all watched it grow over the years, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and be able to talk to everyone up here in Bar Harbor. Nice view too. Really, the title of this talk should maybe be Love of Art, because the displacement and recovery of works of art in World War II certainly shows plenty of that. There was no greater lover of art than Adolf Hitler, the trouble being that the art he loved mostly belonged to other people. His desire to possess, cleanse, and arrange Europe's peoples and patrimony to his own liking would cause almost every work of art in Europe, whether in private or state collections, to be stored, confiscated, stolen, sold, or hidden. And I really mean every work in Europe. Almost nothing that you've ever heard of or that you haven't heard of really was in the same place by the end, between 1933 and 1945. It included paintings, millions of sculptures. This is just one room that the Allies recovered after the war. Tons of furniture, crates of plates, and trunks of silver. It's truly a miracle that any of these fragile things survived. The Mona Lisa, for example, I always have to show the Mona Lisa, was moved several times in the midst of battle in trucks driven by female museum staff who in those days seldom had driver's licenses, and the reason they had to drive was that the men had all been drafted and she was driven from Paris down and moved several times to various chateaux in the south of France. But this sort of thing happened in every country. Soviet curators had to move most of what was in the Hermitage in the surprise attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. They had to go to Siberia in the summer, and they didn't even have time to pack winter clothes, so they got very cold during the next few months. As it became clear to the art community in the rest of Europe that Hitler was headed toward war, major preparations began. This was the first war in which bombing had been a problem, and everyone was aware that the Prado in Madrid, which is the Meninas, Velázquez's famous Meninas that was at the Prado, that the Prado had been bombed in the Spanish Civil War, which was just before the World War II, and that the collection had survived only because of its timely evacuation. And really, that's you could write a whole book about that. They actually stopped the Civil War for a couple of days, and the British and the French organized a train from Switzerland that went to the border, and they took the paintings and put them on, and they went to Geneva, where they stayed until the Spanish Civil War was over. A great international effort. But in the rest of Europe, Polish curators shipped hundreds of tapestries from Krakow and other places down the Vistula and onward to Rome, and eventually those ended up in Canada, where they spent the war. Italian statues came down, and the Venetian collections went to storage on barges like this, which looks, like it might have been better to leave them hanging on the wall, but anyway, they did survive. The Night Watch in Amsterdam, which is a very big painting, as you probably remember, was rolled up, it's being rolled up in a rug, if you can see that, and went to a bunker looking like this. In France, most pictures were taken out of their frames at the Louvre. This is the Grand Gallery of the Louvre with the pictures out of their frames and packed in special boxes that were provided by some of the department stores in France. Packers came from all the stores in their special uniforms. And for the bigger ones that wouldn't fit, this is the raft of the Medusa that wouldn't fit in any box, so they brought scenery trucks from the Comédie Française to move that one because it was too big to even roll up. And I think in the greatest moment of emotion for the French, the Winged Victory, which is really a thing that's put together of 12,000 pieces carefully glued together, was taken down that big stairway in the Louvre, and they were all worried that it was going to not make it. But it was all worth the effort. The British actually did the same, taking everything to a cave in Wales, up icy roads and into a little mountain mine cave. But it was worth the effort because this is what happened to the Rembrandt room at the National Gallery in London during the Blitz. So those things had to be taken to safety. In the United States, people were worried after Pearl Harbor. The American museums also sent some of their best stuff to shelters. It's wonderful to read the minutes of the museum directors' meetings, and one director wondered if anybody would actually notice that anything was gone. But the process did show a little bit of hysteria at first. Museum of Modern Art took its best things down every night and put them in the basement and then brought them up in the morning, but that soon, that didn't really work very well. The Museum of Fine Arts took its sealed off the Japanese galleries and posted Minutemen on the roof. And a congressman in Washington suggested that all the white buildings in Washington, this is the National Archives, be painted in camo, and that the roof of the National Gallery of Art be used as an anti-aircraft emplacement. But in the end, calm did prevail, and the National Gallery of Art's 75 best things went to Biltmore in the Carolinas, and the Met things went to the wilds of suburban Philadelphia. But no U.S. museum actually closed, the consensus being that it was their duty to support public morale. So it was more than 25 years ago, I hate to admit it, on a dark and stormy afternoon in Brussels, where most afternoons were like that, where we were living at the time, that I came across the obituary of a lady called Rose Valland. Now, if you've seen the movie, this is Cate Blanchett. She was a lowly curator at the Louvre, who, the article stated, had been responsible for recovering 60,000 works of art looted from France during the war. And despite the fact that I'd worked in museums off and on for many years by then, I'd simply never thought about what had happened to works of art in World War II. And of course, this made me want to find out. I actually had always been interested in World War II because after the war, my father was sent to our embassy in the Netherlands. And to this day, as I was a very small child, I remember the terrible wastelands of bombed European cities. If you drove around in Germany or France, this is what you saw even by then in 1948. I remember that in Bremerhaven we got lost in rubble heaps where no recognizable buildings were still standing, so you couldn't find your way. And you know, people's houses all looked like this. I mean, people were living in rubble heaps and emerging from basements and whatnot. Getting ahead of myself here, man. And I thought, well, that any work of art could have survived in such desolation seemed impossible. But they had, and it was due entirely to the work of art professionals in all the armies who over and over again risked their lives to secure them. As soon as I started to do research on the subject, I began to hear about the Allied art specialists, now generally referred to as the monuments men. And you may, the ones, let's see, second from, this thing has a pointer on it. So that's John Nicholas Brown, whose son later became director of the National Gallery. And Mason Hammond, I think, is here. And, well, there's a whole crowd of them. I won't name them all, but a lot of those do show up in the movie, which did star, as I gave away a little bit, George Clooney, and everyone can now swoon. The fact that there were art specialists at all in the Allied armies was something of a miracle. The British commands in the North African campaigns had been distinctly reluctant to allot resources to frills like that, sort of saying that the existing rules of land warfare were enough protection for works of art, and that archaeologists and art historians who happened to have been drafted and who just happened to wander by would be able to take care of everything, a process they described as muddling through. But the American museum establishment, who had been informed by European colleagues, led by people like Francis Henry Taylor, who was the director of the Metropolitan Museum at the time, and the directors of the National Gallery Art. Among them here, I have to point out in the center, David Finley, who was the director then, and on the over here, John Walker, who later became director. All these people knew a lot more about what was going on in Europe because they'd been told by their colleagues there. And after months of lobbying, they were able to persuade President Roosevelt, the Congress, and the Army, which wasn't any easier to do then than it is now, I can assure you, that specialist art officers would be needed not only to protect ancient monuments from graffiti-minded soldiers. I mean, this is the kind of thing that the soldiers did in Libya, in North Africa, but that they would also be needed after the war to trace the vast numbers of objects that were known to have been displaced for various reasons since the Nazis had come to power. A presidential commission was set up to supervise this effort and given the princely appropriation of $25,000 to save the patrimony of Europe. Luckily for me, when I began work on the subject, many of the monuments men and women, this is Edith Standen, who was one of the monuments women. I love this picture. It's a terrific picture. They were alive and well and working in their chosen fields. And they soon became my best friends. It was like having 100 aunts and uncles. During my years working at the National Gallery, I had, without knowing it, been surrounded by many of them. And after the war, they'd come back to their jobs, put the records and photos of their wartime experiences in bottom drawers and file cabinets, and gotten on with life. And although some of them had written memoirs, nobody had asked them for years about their activities, which they didn't consider particularly heroic, but they just, they'd gone in the Army, they'd been drafted or volunteered, and did their duty and came home. And I think the World War II generation, certainly my father and everybody else I knew, sort of felt that way, that they did what they were supposed to do. They were quite a group that included the then director and chief curator of the National Gallery over on the side there, David Finley in the middle, and this is a wonderful picture with the three directors, Carter Brown over on the side, who succeeded John Walker. Carter's father, as I said before, was involved in this, and people like Lane Faison, who later became head of the art history department at Williams, and I think taught almost every museum director who is now head of a museum in the United States. I would have lunch with them, and they loved to talk. And my husband teased me about all my bows and having wine for lunch and stuff, but they were all pretty attractive. But of course, it was all just love of art. And some of them were suspicious at first that I was a yellow journalist. There was a wonderful man, Walker Hancock, a sculptor who had a studio in Rockport, Massachusetts, who had been one of the first officers to go into Germany. And this picture of him is before he went into Germany. It's during the Battle of the Bulge, and he's helping people, he's right in the helmet, helping people of a little village in Belgium right on the border rescue their little Madonna from the church which had been hit by artillery. And he just kept going back and bringing out pictures like this. But before we got so friendly, he had set up a huge old tape recorder with big rolls of tape like this, and so he would have proof of what he'd said to me, because he didn't know what I was going to do with the information. But we had such a good time. We had a lot of wine, and when the recorder ran out of tape, we didn't notice. And and then later on, I didn't realize that the whole time we'd been talking, I was sitting on a German Army issue sheepskin coat that had never made it to Stalingrad, but that had been used to wrap up things like the Ghent altarpiece when it was rescued after it was found in a salt mine near Salzburg, where Hitler had hidden it. The experiences of these men was absolutely amazing, and in fact, it was heroic, even though they didn't really think so themselves. Two of them were killed in action, and they found art everywhere in old chateaus, in mines, cowsheds, dungeons, and garages. I mean, it was just all over the place. And it's really hard to imagine how exciting it must have been to tear down a wall or open a door and see something like this, which was actually in a room that was being used as a latrine by British soldiers. For the monuments men, that time was a great adventure, sometimes laced with humor. There was one officer, Charles Parkhurst, who later became head of the Clark, he also was at the National Gallery, who was approaching a place where they thought art had been hidden, and they saw what they thought were enemy soldiers in the woods, so they got out their pistols. None of them was very used to using them, and crept toward these guys, and it turned out to be a casting of Rodin's famous Burghers of Calais, which had been hidden amongst the trees. It really wasn't until they got to Paris. This is James Rorimer down here in the corner, looking at the wall in the Louvre where the Mona Lisa was hung, and they'd written on chalk the names of each painting that was supposed to go there. So it says La Joconde, which is the French nickname for the Mona Lisa. It wasn't really till they got there that they would begin to understand the true methodology and magnitude of Nazi looting. Hitler and Goering had 4 major well-funded bureaucracies that concerned themselves exclusively with art matters, and they were supported by the full force of Nazi military and police organizations. Now, in contrast to us, Hitler alone spent 20 million US dollars on his collecting. Our commission was given 25,000, but of course other things came into it. And his personal agency was established to build up a vast collection for a huge museum complex he intended to build in his hometown of Linz in Austria. Goering, too, who I love this picture of Goering talking to his underlings here, amassed over 2,000 works, and he spent even more time on art collecting. And even the SS was into art, or more actually into archaeology, a field which they dominated completely in Germany in the Nazi era, with the objective of proving that Germanic peoples had been superior to all others from prehistoric times. Apparently Hitler thought this was ridiculous, too, but he didn't want to mess with SS. He just let them go ahead. And a man named Alfred Rosenberg, who was the ideological guru of the party, set up an organization called the ERR, which at first limited itself to collecting Jewish books for a planned anti-Semitic think tank they were going to establish. And here's just a few of the books that were found later. But later he went on to gather all different his organization gathered all different kinds of art. So by war's end, these groups and their many subsidiaries had, by confiscation and purchase in the encapsulated European art market, have accumulated literally tons of objects of every kind. I mean, I think this picture, these are the church bells of France, which they were going to, some of them very historic, which they were going to take back to melt down for war material. But actually, the reshuffling of works of art had begun in Germany way before the war. Germany was supposed to be purged of so-called degenerate works and the artists that were responsible for them. So Hitler himself had no doubts about what was not acceptable. For instance, anything unfinished, like this Kandinsky, or the Blue Horses by Franz Marc. Never mind that Marc had died fighting for Germany in World War I. Political pictures like George Gross's depiction of a Prussian army officer was out because it was a satirization. And Kata Kollwitz says, on this drawing, "No more war," because she was anti-war, not surprising as she had lost her son in World War I. And people like Pizarro because he was Jewish, and on it went. And this was not easy. It took Hitler's own colleagues quite a while to figure out what the rules were. Goebbels, for example, had decorated his whole dining room with watercolors and paintings by Emil Nolde, who was actually a Nazi Party member. But they were too abstract, and when Hitler came to dinner, he had one of his famous fits, and Goebbels took them down, and Nolde was banished to a remote seacoast town where he secretly continued to paint tiny postcards, which, sort of like Emily Dickinson, he hid behind the wallpaper. And that later they did very well on the market in New York, I might say. The restrictions on banned artists were well enforced by the Gestapo, who went so far as to go into their studios and feel the brushes and smell them to see if they've been used lately. The pressure on German museums to get rid of bad art was huge. But by 1937, when they hadn't, complied enough, Hitler sent committees of Nazi artists and theorists right into the galleries, who decided as they walked through what had to go. Now you can imagine this in the Met or someplace, someone saying no, yes, no, yes. And it was very hard work for the committee, because not only had the curators hidden things in closets and bathrooms in order to save them, but because agonizing decisions had to be made. Now this is a painting by Lovis Corinth, and the sky was considered degenerate, because it's kind of messy looking, the sky. But the landscape part was considered okay, and so I guess the proportions were right, and that one was saved. But in the end, over 16,000 works of art were removed from the German museums by the state, and to make sure everybody got the message, a selection was displayed in a special Degenerate art exhibition in Munich, which then went all over the country. And all the writing you see on the walls there, this is Goebbels and Hitler at the exhibition, which is quite a remarkable picture. And all these things are rude remarks about the artists and how much the people paid for them and how terrible that all was. Actually, the exhibition was a huge success, and Hitler had kind of put on counter exhibitions of the art that he thought was acceptable just down the street. And this is the kind of thing that he thought was acceptable. And lots more people went to the Degenerate art show than went to these. These were all for sale, but they didn't do very well. This is called Peasant Venus. Nice socks, I think I say. While the Nazis found these things, however, unacceptable for the home folks, they were not so pure as to ignore their value. So soon there was a thriving trade in works banished from Germany, which was especially beneficial to the new and growing collections of modern art in the United States and elsewhere. Now, this very famous Dr. Gachet of Van Gogh, Goering was the first Nazi official to catch on to the commercial possibilities, and it was his agent who took the Dr. Gachet to Holland and sold it, and later it got to New York and then Japan, and nobody knows quite where it is right now, but for a while it was the most expensive painting ever sold. Later, a special marketing organization was set up by the Nazis where you could buy the banned works only for foreign currency. You could buy it for dollars or, Swiss francs, but not in German money. And one of the dealers engaged to market these things that you see in this picture was now a notorious Hildebrand Gurlitt, who he of the Munich Horde, which there was a big thing about it this fall. His son was found to have 1,200 works of art in his apartment hidden, and many of them had come from this source. But since they were on the market, Hildebrand Gurlitt probably bought a lot of them himself for like $1 or $2. And when after that, after the marketing business didn't go fast enough, they put on an auction in there's Hildebrand Gurlitt, the dealer who worked for the Nazis. But it was a very difficult story because he was a quarter Jewish, and he'd also been fired from his job at the museum where he worked before for being too interested in modern art. So it's not clear how much choice he had in becoming an agent to sell these things. In 1939, the Nazis put on an auction to get rid of all this stuff finally in Lucerne in Switzerland. There's the auction and also a self-portrait by Van Gogh, which is now in Cambridge in the Busch Reisinger Museum. And there were lots of foreign buyers there who were there partly to save the works, like Joseph Pulitzer, who bought this Matisse Bathers with a Turtle, which still hangs in St. Louis today. Most of the leftovers of this degenerate operation were eventually burned in a practice exercise by the Berlin Fire Department, a huge loss to the German museums and indeed to the world. And the degenerate art policy, which is very controversial now, these works of art are not considered looted by the German government or the German museums because it was the German state selling things from their state museums. The policy was very important not only for Germany, but later on it would determine the fate of many a work that was confiscated in the conquered lands, because if it was a degenerate work and it was confiscated, it couldn't go back to Germany, so it would be sold on the market. Along with the purging of degenerate art in Germany went the purging of what the Nazis considered degenerate or alien races. And the first idea was to force such people, principally Jews, to leave Germany. But before they left, they would often be forced to sell most of their assets, often at government-controlled auctions. An outright confiscation of people going into people's houses didn't really start till after Austria was taken by the Germans. This is a cabinet from the Rothschild Palace in Vienna, and it was taken, it was restituted to the Rothschilds, and now is at the Getty. So it's a good thing at the Getty. In 1939, Hitler had invaded Poland and started to impose his ideology there. The Nazis considered the Slavs to be an alien race too, and their long-term policy for Eastern Europe included the total elimination of the Slavic peoples and their culture. I think this is a fact that's not well known in this country. So anything Slavic, like Polish Catholic church treasures or anything like that, was to be confiscated or destroyed, and anything Germanic that was found in the East would be taken back to Germany. One example of that is the Wittstoss altarpiece, which is the pride of Krakow. This was commissioned by the Polish king, but the artist was German, so that gave the Germans the right, they thought, to take it back to Germany because it was created by a German person. Of course, anything that was non-Slavic that was of high quality would be taken too, because it was too good for the Slavs, like this nice Leonardo from Krakow, and these policies would be even more forcefully carried out in the Soviet Union, where they destroyed and carried off things like the Amber Room from the palaces in St. Petersburg. After Poland, it was the turn of the Western countries to be occupied, and here the policy was quite different. These countries were to be annexed one way or another to the fatherland eventually. I love the idea that Himmler was planning to have a little kingdom or duchy in Burgundy. He was going to revive the Duchy of Burgundy for himself. And the national collections of these countries would be eventually totally rearranged to suit Hitler, but only a few things were taken at first. This kind of rearranging was not a new idea for Europe, really, because Napoleon had done very much the same thing after his conquests. I mean, he too put things on display and had parades. This is a parade of things that he got in the Egyptian campaign. There's camels and stuff like that. But after Napoleon's defeat, Lord Wellington, the Allied commander, made the French give back most of what they'd taken. But they were sneaky, and they managed to hide a lot of things that are still there, which they actually worry about still. And Hitler was determined to retrieve those things, plus items taken from Germany as part of the Versailles Treaty, and plus much more. But the sheer magnitude of Nazi looting and its genocidal aspects would really eclipse any previous effort. Nazis didn't just target the national collections of the conquered countries, they also bought huge amounts in the occupied lands. But the buying was far from normal because the money used was itself stolen from the treasuries of the conquered countries and from those persecuted by the Nazis. They paid top dollar or top mark, and many willing sellers rushed off to deal with them, offering items which ranged from junk. There was so much junk sold in Holland that they had to put a limit on what could be sold, and they said paintings couldn't be sold in drugstores and tobacco shops because people were just, taking any old piece of junk, and the Nazis were buying it. But a lot of things were very good, like the so-called Czernin Vermeer, artist in a studio from Vienna, which the family happily sold to Hitler. And of course, there was a very dark side to this trade. As the vies of occupation tightened, especially for Jews, survival became the basis for many a sale. So you could trade a painting or a service, artistic service of some kind for a life. The famous scholar Max Friedlander is a case in point. He had fled to Holland to escape persecution, and when the Nazis came in there, he was sent to a concentration camp, but rescued by Goering, who wanted him to give expertise for some of the pictures in his collection. And to keep him alive, Goering made Friedlander an honorary Aryan. And I've always thought that Friedlander must have particularly enjoyed telling Goering that this Vermeer by the famous faker von Mecheren was the real thing. The story goes that this was Goering's favorite painting, and that Frau Emmy, his wife, had it in her luggage when they were arrested, and it was really the only thing he regretted having done during the whole war, is having been fooled by this painting. The second way the Nazis got things, of course, was just by outright confiscation of private collections who didn't fit into their idea of the pure German Empire. The legal basis for these confiscations, which totally violated the rules of warfare, which protects the property of private citizens, was that the owners had abandoned their property and fled, even if it left in a bank vault like this Rembrandt self-portrait, which belonged to the Rathenau family, who had it in a bank in Holland. And it was really particularly cynical because those sent to death camps were considered to have fled and abandoned their property. Appeals were accepted if a person, by producing endless documentation, could prove he was Aryan. He got a certificate like this in France and could avoid deportation and keep his possessions. But not many people got one of these. In France, thousands of works, confiscated works, were brought into the Jeu de Paume, the nice little museum that used to have, and now has special exhibitions. And for for the Germans, for the Nazis, special exhibitions like this one were set up so that they could come and choose what they wanted. Hitler actually never came himself, but they sent him sort of albums of photos, and he got first choice and took only the best. But Goering came more than 20 times and did very well, filling up 8 houses, like there's Goering at the Jeu de Paume, filled up 8 houses like this one, Karenhall, his main house, with treasures taken from all different countries. Here, too, in this process, the degenerate works were separated from the rest and sold or bartered to dealers who fed them into the general art market. This is sort of a quarantine room where modern art things were put. And this process was very interesting. The Nazis would, for example, trade more than a dozen Picassos, Matisses, etc., including this Matisse, which has been found in the Gerlit collection in Munich. They would, because it was degenerate, it couldn't go back to Germany, they would trade it for one sort of very bad fake Titian. The looting eventually included not only valuable works of art, but the entire contents of the victims' houses. They were supposed to be sent to the new colonies the Germans were making in Eastern Europe. And this is just one warehouse of furniture and household goods and clothes that they did not manage to send out of France before the liberation of Paris. There was resistance to the confiscation process. In France, Rose Valland, who is Kate Blanchett, now she's in the French army, being a monuments lady, and it was her obituary that inspired me. She became an unlikely heroine. Over and over again, she risked her life to smuggle out photographs and coded lists of the hiding places in which the works were being sent. And at the end of the war, working with the resistance operatives in France and the French railroad, she managed to delay a whole trainload of art until the Allies arrived. And it was an extraordinary thing. One of the officers commanding the unit that liberated this train was Alexander Rosenberg, and part of his family's collections were on this train. So it's a really remarkable thing. There is another movie called The Train, which is based on Rose Valland's book, and it has Burt Lancaster and I think Jean Moreau. It's a terrific old sort of film noir style movie, and I do recommend it. It's about the train. As the tide of war turned, the restraint shown by the Nazis in regard to the state-owned collections of the West really faltered very badly, and Himmler tried to take the Bayeux tapestry, but was thwarted by his own officers and the fall of Paris. But his colleagues in Belgium did better, making off in a small boat on a stormy sea with Michelangelo's beautiful Bruges Madonna, and I think that episode is shown in the Monuments Men movie, or something close to it. Far more impressive than that even was the removal of about half the treasures of Florence. Here they are taking a few things away to a remote castle on the Austrian border, supposedly for safekeeping. And they were moved just on open trucks, you can see, with just a little stuff around them, a miracle right through the battle zone, so it's a miracle that anything survived. Allied forces crossed into Germany in late 1944, and even after all they had experienced elsewhere, the Monuments Men found the conditions in Germany really shocking. Here they moved in a surreal landscape of skeleton cities. I think it's an extraordinary term, but because they do look like skeletons, with no government, groups of homeless DPs, citizens, and freed prisoners wandering around burning priceless books like these, and furniture, everything, because people trying to keep warm. And people could pick up things in the ruins, including, and American soldiers did a certain amount of looting. This is something from the old church of Quedlinburg, now that ended up in East Germany. And there was a soldier who picked up these things. It's tiny, it's 11th century or something, and he would just mail it home through the APO, through the military mail. And he ended up having a secret life in Texas. There's a wonderful book about that, too. So, but there were actually few buildings left to protect in Germany, and the monuments men didn't know where the great German collections or the Nazi loot was hidden. They would come across a place like this, and there could be a Mona Lisa or something in one of those packages, or maybe they were baby shoes, but they had to check every single thing like that. But in Indiana Jones-like operations, they would eventually find them in the more than 2,000 hiding places they looked in. I think the most famous one of the hiding places was Hitler's special mine at Alt-Aussee near Salzburg, which had been specially fitted up, in the heat, right at the end, the worst part of the war. They spent money building this for Hitler's collections. But there were others, such as the Merkers mine, which held not only tons of art, but the entire gold reserves of the Reich. Goering's collections, here displayed by his personal curator, were scattered in and around Berchtesgaden, where he'd taken them on his special trains. There were 3 or 4 trains, and the trains were all looted by the locals, but there was plenty for the 101st Airborne to deal with, sort of an unusual thing for them to do. Monuments men found the crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire taken from Vienna, walled up in Nuremberg, and the confiscated French collections in the fabled castle of Neuschwanstein. The quantities are just vast and unbelievable. Here is James Rorimer, later director of the Metropolitan Museum, looking at the Rothschild jewels that were at Neuschwanstein. And here is a whole place full of Torah scrolls, just thousands and thousands of them. The Army proudly did its best to secure all these objects, and I don't know if you can see this wonderful sign, but it says, restored old masters, the crown of Charlemagne, manuscripts of Beethoven, 8th Infantry Division, Van Gogh. They were very proud of it, but it wasn't very efficient, and so they soon had to decide what to do with it all. And after Eisenhower had looked at a few of the storage places, it was decided to bring everything together in several collecting points, which would soon have the best collections ever put together in the world. Here's one little item that was at Munich, because it was not only the stolen collections, but the great German collections were put there. So they then began to sort them out. Everything was photographed. Officers came from all the different countries to identify things, and then they started sending them back. It was sort of like running a movie backwards. And here is the lady with the ermine, the Leonardo from Krakow going back, arriving in Krakow, and the Florentine collections coming back on a wonderful a bunch of American trucks flying flags. These were great propaganda opportunities, and it did take a while for the American armies to realize how important saving art was to the people of the countries we occupied. Once things got home, like this Chardin, which is now at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is a long story, special commissions in each country had to figure out just who the objects belonged to, which was not always an easy job when it came to confiscated private collections, especially as the owners had often moved elsewhere or been killed. And quite a number of these unclaimed and unidentified items are still the subject of new claims and disputes to this day. The Soviet Union, which also had art specialists called trophy brigades, had, of course, also found tons of art. And they had quite a different attitude. They just put it all on trains and took it back to the Soviet Union, regardless of who owned it. And in the 1950s, they did give back lots of things like this beautiful Dürer to Dresden, but only to East Bloc countries. And anything belonging to the West or to private individuals, since they didn't believe in private property, like this nice Degas, remained hidden in remote monasteries or the secret vaults of the Hermitage and the Pushkin. Here's another Van Gogh. And the curators of these things, who did take very good care of them on pain of being Siberia, were not allowed until about 15 years ago to reveal where the art was hidden. Of course, now we know where it is, but in the meantime, the Russian Duma, the Congress, has nationalized it all, so that it seems unlikely that anything will ever come back from there. Of course, not everything was recovered by the official agencies of East and West. If you see this in a flea market, get it and tell the State Department right away this is one of the most important missing paintings of Raphael that belongs in Poland. And hundreds of works are said to have been stolen or hidden or all through the war theaters or destroyed, but you can't really be sure. There's a beautiful Bellini from, that was supposedly burned up in Berlin, but everybody thinks it might turn up somewhere. So the searches go on and on. The restitution of recovered private items following the war was not easy, and it really wasn't always fair. If one's possessions were relatively major, like this Vermeer astronomer that belonged to the Rothschilds and had been chosen and confiscated by Hitler or Goering, recovery was pretty straightforward because their collections were carefully cataloged by the Nazis, and they listed the original owners that they'd stolen things from without shame because they were proud that they'd come from good collections. And even then, making claims was hard work, requiring endless paperwork. The Rothschilds had so much stuff that everything was brought back to these big warehouses in Paris, and they would send the butler down to say, "What about this one?" And he would say, "Yes, madam, that was the one that was behind the door in the guest room." So some people just had too many things, but it was not easy and very daunting, and some people just couldn't deal with the whole thing. So a lot of people gave up in despair or, excuse me, made bad settlements that would haunt them and the later owners later. For things that had utterly vanished, the German government did give some compensation in the 60s. So by now, it is far harder to recover things that were dispersed in the art market and could have gone almost anywhere. The legacy of Nazi looting lingers on, and many objects do remain to be found, but the miracle, really, is that so much survived the devastation, like the windows of Chartres. They survived the most destructive war in history. And this was really not by chance. We owe an enormous debt to people of all kinds who risked their lives to safeguard the human patrimony. And I think of men, and one of my favorite is Cesare Fazzola, the man with the shades in the middle there, who was the librarian of the Uffizi, who ran back and forth between the British and German lines when they were taking Florence, and to persuade both the Germans and the Allies not to use paintings like this one, Michelangelo, a panel painting, not to use it to make tea. This New Zealand troops were using it as a tea table. So I hope that the next time you wander through the peaceful galleries of a museum, you will think of all the adventures that these silent objects have had, and also of the monuments men who preserved them for us. Thank you very much.